The security badge in my hand stopped working at 9:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was standing at the turnstile of a building with my name on the patent that built it, watching a green light turn red. Behind me, 20 feet away, my wife was standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, and next to her was a 26-year-old intern named Caleb Voss wearing a blazer he could not afford on an intern's salary. Neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. The dead badge said everything. My name is Nathaniel Cole. I'm 41 years old. I'm an engineer, and for the last 9 years, I was the chief technology officer of a company called Hartwell Dynamics, a mechanical engineering firm outside Denver that built precision hydraulic systems for the agricultural and construction equipment industry. I say I was the CTO because, as of that morning, standing at a turnstile that no longer recognized me, I technically still held the title. What I did not have anymore was access to the building, access to my own office, or apparently access to my own wife's decision-making process. I want to tell you exactly how this happened, because the ending is not what either of them expected, and by the time I'm done, you'll understand why revoking a single piece of paper can bring down a company faster than any lawsuit ever could. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need the foundation before you understand how deep this betrayal actually went. I met my wife, Renata, in 2011. I was finishing my master's in mechanical engineering at Colorado School of Mines, and she was 29, already working in finance for a private equity firm in Denver. We met through a mutual colleague at an industry mixer, one of those forgettable networking events where nobody expects to meet anyone real. Renata was not forgettable. She had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was already 3 moves ahead of you in a conversation you didn't know you were playing. I fell for that mind before I fell for anything else. In 2013, I developed a design for a self-regulating hydraulic valve system, a piece of engineering that solved a pressure loss problem that had been quietly costing agricultural equipment manufacturers money for decades. I didn't have the capital to manufacture it myself, so I did what any engineer with a good idea and no business background does. I filed for a patent, and I brought the design to Renata, because by then we were engaged, and because she understood capital in a way I never would. She didn't just support the idea, she built the company around it. She secured our first round of investment from 2 private equity contacts of hers. She structured the operating agreement. She hired our first controller, our first office manager, our first 6 employees. I built the engineering. She built the business. We got married in 2014. The same year, Hartwell Dynamics opened its first real facility in Golden, Colorado, 12 employees and a single production line. Here is the part I need you to understand clearly because it matters for everything that comes after. The patent, the actual intellectual property that the entire company was built on, was filed under my name alone. Not the company's name. Not a joint filing. Mine. Renata knew this. She'd been in the room when Patricia, our attorney at the time, explained the structure to us. I licensed the patent to Hartwell Dynamics through an exclusive licensing agreement, which meant the company could use it, manufacture it, and profit from it. But the underlying ownership never left my hands. At the time, this felt like a formality, a piece of paper neither of us thought we'd ever need to think about again. I trusted her completely. Why would I need to protect myself from my own wife? For 8 years, that structure never mattered, because for 8 years, we were exactly what we told people we were. Partners. She ran operations and finance. I ran engineering and product development. We grew from 12 employees to over 140. We expanded from 1 hydraulic valve system into an entire product line used by 3 of the top agricultural equipment manufacturers in North America. By 2022, Hartwell Dynamics was doing just over $31 million in annual revenue, and industry publications were writing about us as one of the fastest-growing mechanical engineering firms in the Mountain West. I was proud of what we built. I was prouder of how we built it, together at a kitchen table with spreadsheets and a whiteboard. The same way most real companies get built before anyone in a suit ever notices them. Then, in early 2023, we brought on an operations intern through a university partnership program. His name was Caleb Voss, 24 years old at the time, an MBA candidate at the University of Denver, sharp, ambitious, and very, very good at watching people. I want to be fair to him here, because fairness matters even when someone has wronged you. Caleb was talented. He picked up operational workflows faster than any intern I'd seen in 9 years of running that company. He asked good questions in meetings. He worked long hours. On paper, hiring him was the right call. What I did not see, because I was in the machine shop 3 days a week solving pressure tolerance problems and trusting my wife to run the business side, was where Caleb's attention was actually going. He wasn't just learning operations. He was learning Renata, learning what she valued, what frustrated her about me, what she wished I understood about the pressure she carried running the business side of a company that bore my name on every patent filing and every piece of marketing material. He was learning patiently and carefully how to become the person she talked to instead of the person she was married to. I noticed small things starting around the summer of 2023. And like most people who trust the person they've built a life with, I explained them away. Renata started staying late for what she called strategy sessions with Caleb, sessions that had nothing on the calendar and no documentation afterward. She started using phrases in conversation that weren't hers, phrases I recognized from Caleb's presentation decks. When I raised a concern about his scope creeping into decisions that belonged to senior staff, she told me I was threatened by someone smarter than me. I let that comment go because I didn't want to believe what it actually meant. By January of this year, Caleb was no longer an intern. Renata had pushed through a full-time hire, a role she created specifically for him, Director of Strategic Operations, reporting directly to her. He was 26 years old, 2 years out of a completed MBA, sitting in a director-level seat at a company he'd been at for less than 18 months. I raised it once in a board meeting, carefully, professionally, asking whether the title and compensation matched the actual experience on the market. Renata shut the conversation down in front of the other board members, saying we could discuss internal staffing decisions privately. We never did discuss it privately. There was never a good time, according to her. I kept building. I kept solving engineering problems. I kept trusting the woman I married, because trusting her was the only version of our marriage and our company I had ever known. I told myself the distance I felt was just the pressure of growth, the natural friction of scaling a company past 140 employees. I was wrong, and I would not understand exactly how wrong until the morning my badge turned red in a building with my own patent bolted, quite literally, into every machine on the production floor. Because here is the question I want you sitting with as we move into what happened next. If the entire company, every product, every contract, every dollar of that $31 million in annual revenue existed only because of a single piece of intellectual property that legally belonged to one person, what exactly did my wife think she was going to do when that person walked out the door? The week everything broke open started on a Tuesday in March, 4 weeks before the badge failed at the turnstile. I was in the machine shop, reviewing tolerance data on a new valve prototype when my assistant, a woman named Dorothy, who had worked at Hartwell Dynamics since year 2, walked in and quietly closed the door behind her. She told me there was a meeting on the calendar for Thursday morning, a leadership review, and my name was not on the attendee list. I had never in 9 years been excluded from a leadership review at my own company. I asked her who called the meeting. She said Renata had. Through Caleb's office, I didn't confront anyone that day. I did what I've always done when something feels wrong before I fully understand why. I started paying attention to details I'd been too busy to notice. I pulled up the internal calendar system and looked back through the last 3 months. Caleb had been listed as a co-owner on for vendor contracts I'd never reviewed. He'd been added to distribution lists for supplier negotiations that touched directly on production costs for equipment built using my patented valve design. None of this had come across my desk. All of it had gone through Renata's approval chain instead of mine. Even though our own operating agreement required dual sign-off from both of us on anything above a certain dollar threshold, on Wednesday, I asked Renata directly what the Thursday meeting was about. She told me it was a routine operations review and that my presence wasn't necessary since it focused on internal restructuring. I said I was the chief technology officer of the company, and restructuring, by definition, involved me. She looked at me for a long moment and said something I will never forget. She said, "Nathaniel, you build things. Let us handle running things. Us, not we." US, meaning her and Caleb, spoken to me in my own kitchen like I was a contractor being informed of a scheduling change. I didn't sleep much that Wednesday night. I lay there next to a woman I had built a marriage and a company with for 11 years, and I understood clearly and completely for the first time that something had shifted so far beneath the surface that I hadn't felt the ground move. Thursday morning, I went to the office anyway. I walked into the conference room 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, and I sat down. Renata arrived with Caleb beside her, carrying a laptop and a folder of printed documents. When she saw me sitting there, her expression didn't shift into surprise. It shifted into something closer to irritation, the look of someone whose plan had encountered an obstacle they hadn't accounted for. She sat down across from me and said we needed to talk about the direction of engineering leadership going forward. Caleb opened his folder. Inside was a proposal, formatted cleanly with section headers and a conclusion, recommending what he called an engineering advisory restructure. Stripped of the corporate language, it was simple. My role as CTO would be redefined as a consulting position. Reduced hours, reduced authority, no direct reports, and all product development decisions would rue through a newly created product strategy office, headed by Caleb, reporting to Renata. I asked Renata if she had read this document before the meeting. She said she had contributed to it. I asked her when exactly she and Caleb had decided that a 26-year-old with 18 months at the company should have authority over engineering decisions at a firm built entirely on my patented technology. She told me my tone was becoming hostile and that this was exactly the kind of reaction the proposal was designed to address. I asked what that meant. Caleb answered instead of her. He said there had been concerns raised by senior staff about my leadership style, that I was resistant to new operational input, and that several engineers had described me as difficult to work with during product reviews. I want to be clear about what those concerns actually were, because I looked into it afterward. 2 engineers had mentioned in a casual survey, one that Caleb had personally administered without my knowledge, that I held product designs to a strict tolerance standard and pushed back hard when specs didn't meet safety margins. That was true. It was also my job. Caleb had taken ordinary engineering rigor and repackaged it as a hostile leadership pattern, and Renata had signed off on believing it without ever once asking me directly what had happened in those reviews. I stood up from that meeting and told them I needed time to think. I did not think for very long, because 3 days later, on the following Monday, I arrived at the building and my badge failed at the turnstile. Renata was standing in the hallway. Caleb was standing next to her. Neither one of them said a word as I stood there watching a green light turn red, watching 9 years of my life reduced to a single denied access signal on a keypad. I had personally approved the installation budget for. I did not yell. I did not demand an explanation in front of the staff filtering past us into the lobby. I turned around, walked back to my car, and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I started the engine. And in those 11 minutes, I made the same decision Renata had apparently already made about me. I decided I was done asking for explanations from people who had already stopped considering me a partner. The first call I made was not to a lawyer. It was to my patent attorney, a man named Walter Kessler, who had handled the original filing back in 2013 and who understood the exact architecture of what I owned and what Hartwell Dynamics only had the right to use. I told him what happened. He asked me one question before anything else. He asked, "Nathaniel, do you still have full control of the licensing agreement, or did anything change in the last few years that I don't know about?" I told him nothing had changed. The exclusive license Hartwell Dynamics operated under was still tied directly to me as the individual patent holder. Structured that way from day one because Renata herself, back when we were building this together with nothing but trust between us, had insisted the intellectual property stay separate from the corporate entity for tax and liability reasons. She had built the wall that protected me. She just never imagined I'd be the one standing on the other side of it looking back at her. Walter went quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about every day since. He said, "Do you understand what happens to a company that manufactures 100% of its revenue-generating product line using a license that can be legally revoked by one signature?" I told him I understood exactly what happens. I had helped write the safety tolerances for every valve that company had ever shipped. I knew precisely how deep that patent ran into the bones of Hartwell Dynamics, how every production line, every existing contract, every promise made to 3 major agricultural equipment manufacturers depended entirely on a piece of paper with my name on it and nobody else's. Walter asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I needed 48 hours to think it through carefully because I am not a man who moves without thinking. But I already knew, sitting in that parking lot with a dead badge in my jacket pocket, exactly what the next step would be. What I didn't know yet, and what I would only discover 2 days later when Walter pulled the full licensing file and cross-referenced it against Hartwell Dynamics' active production contracts, was just how fragile the entire company actually was underneath its $31 million in annual revenue. And what he found in that file was about to turn a quiet, private decision into something neither Renata nor Caleb would ever see coming until it was already too late to stop. What Walter found in that licensing file explained why Caleb and Renata had moved as fast as they did. Hartwell Dynamics was not just built on my patent, it was entirely dependent on it. Every one of the company's 3 major manufacturing contracts, the ones that accounted for nearly 90% of that $31 million in annual revenue, contained a clause requiring the company to maintain uninterrupted, exclusive access to the patented valve technology as a condition of the agreement. If that license lapsed or was revoked for any reason, each contract carried an automatic termination clause triggered within 30 days. In other words, Renata and Caleb had spent months building an entire operational takeover. New titles, new reporting structures, a plan to push me into an advisory role with no authority without ever once checking the one document that determined whether any of it would matter. They had been so focused on controlling the org chart that they never stopped to ask who actually controlled the company's ability to legally exist. Walter laid it out for me plainly. He said, "Nathaniel, you don't need a lawsuit. You need 30 days and a certified letter." I sat with that for a long time because I want to be honest with you about something. Even after everything, even after the badge, even after watching my wife stand silently in a hallway while a 26-year-old decided my professional future, some part of me did not want to be the man who ended a company I'd spent 9 years building with my own hands. That hesitation lasted exactly 1 more week until I found out what happened next. I reached out to Dorothy, my former assistant, under the pretense of retrieving some personal items from my office. She told me, quietly and off the record, that Caleb had been promoted again, this time to Chief Operating Officer, a title that had never existed at Hartwell Dynamics before, created specifically for him less than 3 weeks after I'd been walked out. She told me Renata had announced it to senior staff as a sign that the company was, in her words, moving forward with fresh energy. I asked Dorothy if my name had come up in that meeting. She said it hadn't, not once, as if 9 years of engineering work had simply been absorbed into the walls of a building I could no longer enter. That was the moment my hesitation ended, not out of anger, though I won't pretend anger wasn't part of it. It ended because I finally understood something clearly. Renata and Caleb were not planning to bring me back in any capacity. They were planning to erase me from a company that could not legally exist without me. And they were doing it with a confidence that told me they genuinely believed I would never find out how thin the ground beneath them actually was. I called Walter back the next morning and told him to prepare the notice of license revocation. Under the terms of the original 2013 agreement, I was required to give Hartwell Dynamics 30 days written notice, along with a documented reason. I gave them one. Material breach of trust in the governance of intellectual property use. Specifically, the unauthorized restructuring of engineering oversight without the consent of the patent holder, a direct violation of Section 4 of our licensing agreement, the section requiring joint approval on any structural change affecting product development authority. The letter went out on a Tuesday by certified mail, copied to the company's legal counsel and to every board member, including Renata. I did not call her beforehand. I did not warn her. I had learned, over the previous month, exactly how much warning she had extended to me before pressing a button and having me removed from my own building. None. So I extended her the same courtesy she'd extended me. For the first 10 days, nothing happened publicly. I later learned, through Walter, who received the company's response through official legal channels, that Hartwell Dynamics outside counsel had scrambled immediately to explore every possible avenue to challenge the revocation. They looked at arguing implied consent through years of operational precedent. They looked at claiming the original 2013 agreement had been superseded by later operational practice. Walter had anticipated every one of those arguments years earlier because he was the one who drafted the original language specifically to prevent exactly this kind of challenge. Every avenue they explored closed within days. On day 17, Renata called me directly for the first time since the badge failed. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message, and I want to tell you honestly, her voice on that message did not sound like the confident woman who had told me to let her and Caleb handle running things. It sounded like someone who had just realized, in real time, exactly how much authority she had handed to a 26-year-old who had never once had to answer for the legal architecture underneath the company he now claimed to run. I called her back 2 days later, not out of sympathy, but because Walter advised me that a direct conversation, properly documented, would strengthen the eventual settlement position. She asked me to reconsider. She said the company employed 140 people who had nothing to do with what happened between us. I told her I had thought about every one of those 140 people, and that the person responsible for putting their jobs at risk was not me. It was a person who decided that ordinary engineering judgment could be reframed as hostile behavior, and the person who signed off on believing that framing without ever asking me directly whether it was true. She asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I told her yes. I told her exactly what it would take. Full reinstatement of my original role and authority. Immediate termination of Caleb's employment for cause. Given what Walter's team had also uncovered by then, several vendor contracts Caleb had steered toward companies connected to his own prior professional network, processed without the dual sign-off our compliance policy required, and a renegotiated operating agreement that permanently protected my authority over any decision touching product development or engineering leadership. She agreed to all of it within 4 days, because she had no other option. The 30-day window was closing. 3 of her manufacturing partners had already begun quietly reaching out to competitors as a contingency, and the board, once they understood the full financial exposure, made it very clear to Renata that saving the company mattered more than saving whatever she and Caleb had built together in that product strategy office. Caleb was terminated on day 2. I know this because Walter received formal documentation as part of the reinstatement agreement. The termination letter cited unauthorized vendor influence and conflict of interest, the same pattern Walter's team had flagged during the licensing dispute. I never spoke to Caleb again. I heard through Dorothy that he left Denver entirely within a few months, taking a role at a firm 2 states away, and I have not thought about him much since, because he was never really the point. He was an instrument. The real story was always the woman who let him convince her that 11 years of trust could be replaced by a title and a folder of printed slides. I withdrew the revocation notice on day 12, 1 day before it would have triggered the automatic termination clauses across all 3 manufacturing contracts. The company survived. I made sure of that, not for Renata, but for the 140 people whose paychecks had nothing to do with the decisions made above their heads. Renata and I separated formally 3 months later. I kept my full ownership of the patent and my role as Chief Technology Officer, restructured this time with protections that no future restructuring proposal could ever touch again without my direct written consent. She kept her equity position and her role running the business side. Though the board now required dual sign-off from both of us on every operational decision, above a threshold that used to be 5 times higher, we do not speak much now. Beyond what the business requires, I still walk through that building every day. I still solve pressure tolerance problems in the machine shop 3 days a week. And every time I badge through that turnstile, the light turns green, exactly the way it should. Because some things, once you understand what they're actually worth, you never let anyone put a red light in front of again. People ask me sometimes if I regret how close I let it get, whether I should have protected myself sooner, built more distance between the man who builds things and the people who decide what he's allowed to build. And the honest answer is no. Because I don't think I ever would have understood the difference between a partner and a person managing me until I watched exactly how far she was willing to let someone else make that decision for her. Some lessons only arrive at full price. Mine arrived through a dead badge, a certified letter, and 29 days that changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I married.